These are the lecture notes for Chapter 8 on photosynthesis. This is another chapter that is on a single chemical reaction. I think you will find it a little bit easier than Chapter 7 because it's really the reverse of what happens in cellular respiration. And also, there is an electron transport chain in Chapter 8 as well in photosynthesis. Um, but we've already learned it, so it works pretty much the same way. So let's talk about organisms that carry out photosynthesis first, and we'll start by discussing the difference between autotrophs. Autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs consume food. There are two types of autotrophs. Some use sunlight to make their food, and they are called photoautotrophs. Photo is the sunlight part. And they're going to include plants, as well as there are some organisms that can carry out photosynthesis that are not in the plant kingdom. Algae are actually in the kingdom Protista, but they are in the domain Eukarya. And cyanobacteria, of course, are prokaryotic, so they are in the domain bacteria. And then besides photoautotrophs, there are other autotrophic organisms. There are chemoautotrophs. I've never heard it chemiautotrophs. I'm sure that I is supposed to be an O. I'm sorry. Chemoautotrophs, such as thermophilic bacteria that live, for example, in Yellowstone National Park and the hot springs. They'll live at the openings of underwater volcanoes. Thermophilic means heat loving. So these use other forms of chemical energy. They capture energy from inorganic compounds instead of sunlight. Sorry, I don't mean to keep marking through the words, but anyway, they capture energy from inorganic chemicals um, and make their own food that way. They still convert carbon dioxide into food, into carbohydrate. So moving on, of course, these are deer and they are heterotrophs. So heterotrophs include animals. And heterotrophs also include fungi and most bacteria. So this means they consume food. It doesn't mean they necessarily eat like we do. They don't necessarily ingest. Sometimes, like with fungi and bacteria, they might absorb their food. But heterotrophs do have to ingest. They do have to consume their food. They don't make their own food. So this is an overview of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis uses solar energy, meaning sunlight, to produce sugar, some type of sugar. As we learn about photosynthesis, we're going to use glucose, but we also know there are other sugars and other carbohydrates that plants produce. So plants can also produce fructose, as well as glucose, and but we're just going to use glucose just to keep it simple. And photosynthetic organisms produce sugar from carbon dioxide and water. And the waste product, if you remember in cellular respiration, was carbon dioxide. The waste product in photosynthesis is actually not a waste when we think about it. It's produced as a byproduct of photosynthesis, but and so it technically is a waste product, but it is definitely useful to the atmosphere and to other organisms, as well as to the organism that produces it. Because one thing that a lot of people don't realize is a plant carries out photosynthesis, to make its own food, right? So a plant carries out photosynthesis and through photosynthesis produces glucose. But it can't just take that glucose and just magically make energy from it. It still has to convert that glucose into ATP. So the plant still has to carry out cellular respiration to break down the glucose into ATP. So what we're seeing here is a representation of photosynthesis. This is a typical plant. A tree is absorbing sunlight through its chlorophyll pigment molecules and other types of pigment molecules. It's absorbing carbon dioxide through the leaves, and it's absorbing water through the roots, and then using that to produce sugars, primarily glucose and oxygen. Before exploring the chemical nature of photosynthesis, let's look at the sources of its components. We just did, really, but water is absorbed through the roots of a plant. Carbon dioxide is acquired from the air. And plants don't have noses, but they do have small pores on the underside of leaves. And you see a microscopic photograph here of those pores. Those pores are called, one pore is called a stoma, not stroma, because you're also going to learn about stroma with an R. But stoma or stomata, stomata is the plural form of that word, are the pores on the underside of a leaf that can close or open. And when they are open, they can take in carbon dioxide and convert that carbon dioxide into glucose. So another thing is the waste products. Oxygen is a waste product and it exits through the stomata, and sunlight, of course, is captured by the pigment chlorophyll, which is found in the chloroplast of the plant cells. The leaves are the primary organ of the plant that absorb sunlight, that carry out photosynthesis. But sometimes it can occur in the stem as well. Some plants have green stems. It just depends on the plant. But it's primarily the leaf that is designed to carry out photosynthesis and to absorb sunlight and carry out photosynthesis. And then the food, the glucose or fructose or whatever type of simple sugar is produced in the leaves, and then it can be transported sometimes all the way down to the roots where it can be stored as starch, like potatoes. This is a video clip that you can watch if you would like to watch it. It is, I'm trying to find which slide it is. I'm sorry. It is on slide 6. So you can watch this. I can tell from looking at it, this is the inside of a leaf. In fact, it looks like the inside of a chloroplast, but I'm not 100% sure. Okay, so we had one overall equation for cellular respiration. So we have an overall equation for photosynthesis, and it's really easy because if you learn cellular respiration, which I hope you did, then photosynthesis is just the reverse. So we put the products from cellular respiration as the reactants in photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide and water are the reactants. Carbon dioxide enters through the stomata and water enters through the roots. And this happens in the presence of sunlight. So that's why sunlight is written over the arrow, because sunlight is needed for this reaction to occur. And sugar in the form of glucose or fructose is produced, C6H12O6. and oxygen as well. So sugar and oxygen, that are the products in photosynthesis, were the reactants in cellular respiration. So you just have to reverse it, and there you have it. You don't have to learn a new equation. But just like cellular respiration, this doesn't happen all in one step. There were 4 metabolic pathways in cellular respiration. There are just 2 metabolic pathways in photosynthesis. One is called the light reactions, and the other is called the Calvin cycle reactions. Now, the light reactions, which are often called the light-dependent reactions, are used to produce ATP and a molecule called NADPH, which will go on to, in the Calvin cycle, to help convert carbon dioxide into sugar. So the light reaction absorbs light energy and converts it to chemical energy. In other words, it's going to produce the chemical energy in the form of ATP, and instead of NADH this time, it's NADPH, which is very similar to NADH in the fact that it's an electron carrier. You can see that it has a hydrogen on the end, and just a reminder, the hydrogen atom carries 1 electron and 1 proton, or hydrogen ion. Now, the light reactions occur in a specific part of the chloroplast. The light reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast. And here you see a stack of thylakoids called a granum. Each individual disc is a thylakoid, and the entire stack is called a granum. Many stacks are called grana. So the light reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes, or in the thylakoids of the chloroplast, and their purpose is to produce ATP and NADPH. And then the Calvin cycle reactions, which don't need light, they don't happen in the dark, they just don't need light, use the ATP and the NADPH to convert carbon dioxide into sugar. And the Calvin cycle reactions occur in the stroma, which is just, the stroma is like the cytoplasm. It's the fluid-filled region that surrounds the thylakoids. Chloroplast is very similar to a mitochondrion in that it has a double membrane. It has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The stroma, notice it says not to be confused with stoma. Stoma are the pores in the underside of a leaf for gas exchange. The stroma is the fluid-filled region in a chloroplast where the Calvin cycle reactions occur. Grana are stacks of thylakoids. The thylakoids contain chlorophyll. They contain the pigment chlorophyll as well as some other pigments that exist to capture sunlight. And you may see the term lumen. That is the space inside the thylakoid. Little bit of information about light energy. What is light energy? It is energy from the electromagnetic spectrum. It is composed of photon particles that travel in waves. The longer wavelengths carry less energy, and the shorter wavelengths carry a higher amount of energy. And we can see the visible light spectrum. It's just one small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the visible light spectrum, you can remember the colors by, I was looking to see, yeah, you can remember the colors by Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And red would be a longer wavelength, which would mean red has the least energy. Violet would have a shorter wavelength, which means it has the most energy. So what's important for you to understand are the pigments in the plant, and which energy, which visible light wavelengths that they absorb.